The air tasted of iron and smoke and old snow, as if Winterfell had drawn a breath and held it for 1,000 years. Wind settled into the gaps of stone and timber and armor, wove through shuttered arrow slits, combed at banners stiff with frost, and came to rest against Jon Snow's face like a cold hand. From the battlements he could see the long, dark plain where the army of the dead waited without sound and, he thought, without time. Far out on the field, their pale ranks blurred into the snowfall until distinction failed and the night itself felt populated. Specks of hunger, a hush of blue fire where eyes should be. He felt there watching the way a man feels the weight of a buried truth. The torches on the walls cracked and spat resin. The trench below, their ring of sharpened stakes and dragonglass, lay unlit as planned. All the preparations sat like held breath, too. Men and women in furs and mail at their posts, the unsullied fixed on their captain's hand, the Dothraki restless on horses tempered by cold. The godswood behind him whispered with red leaves thick with damp. Somewhere in its silence, Bran Stark's eyes were the color of the world. Jon's hands ached. He flexed them inside his gloves and felt the busted knuckles from training, the old wolf of ache at his sword wrist, the half-bitten scar from a White Walker's spear on the flesh beneath his ribs. The scars spoke a language, one he had learned before the wall and beyond it, a grammar of loss and stubbornness. He was cold, and the cold made the past very sharp. "Lord Snow," Davos said at his shoulder. The Southron honorific always sounded like a stone in Davos's mouth. Heavy, practical. "Not too late to tell me this is a bad thought." "It is a bad thought," Jon said. Then he breathed out, and his breath smoked like a promise. "It's the one we've got. Bad thoughts are like old debts. Come due whether you want them to or not." Davos peered into the whiteness. "I've fought smugglers with more mercy in them. Smugglers want coin." Jon pointed at the field where no breath smoked from the ranks, where nothing moved. "He wants the world to be quiet." "He'll not parley," Davos said, but it had the sound of hope more than prediction. "He never does." Jon glanced down to the yard, where Tyrion paced, the wind trying to pluck his fur collar like nimble fingers. Beyond him, Sansa stood near a brazier, white fur across her shoulders, face brighter than the fire. Jorah Mormont spoke with Grey Worm in the square, patient and steady, a mountain in motion. The hound paced in a shadowed corner by the gate, turning back and forth like a bear that could smell a cave it wouldn't enter. Arya was nowhere. That was Arya's way. He felt before he heard her. The sudden steadiness in the air, the weight of a gaze that cut like a narrow blade. When Daenerys came to stand beside him, she brought heat with her in the smell of dragon and oiled leather, in the bitten copper tang that clung to her hair after flights. She wore no crown. There were no kings in the face of that darkness. "Say it," she murmured. "I will ride out and offer him single combat." Her breath hitched. She stared at him long enough to make the cold feel like heat. "He doesn't bargain. He understands signs." Jon nodded toward that still expanse. "He understands victory. If he kills me before them all, they break. If I—" He stopped. It felt wrong to say it aloud, like naming a child before the breath had taken hold. "If he accepts and what follows saves even a tenth of those lives, then we stake the living world on a wordless creature's sense of honor." She stopped herself from laughing. The sound came out like a cough. "And if he refuses? If he sends the whites to tear you limb from limb while I watch from the sky? Will you call that mercy?" "I'll call it a chance I took because there were no others." He looked at her then. There were old words in his throat, words he'd thought he'd say to no one. "I've stood where the world narrows and felt it want to close. I've died once, and I don't fear dying, only leaving unfinished things. I have your eyes in my sleep." He said, "None of them. The men and women in those trenches. They're not numbers, Your Grace." She flinched, the title like a thrown bit of ice. He saw it, but he couldn't change it now. There was a line between them that the cold had drawn. It might melt. Later. He could feel later like a fragile thing. He didn't trust it. Tyrion arrived, snow clinging to his beard like salt, eyes bright from thought and wine that had not warmed him. I'm told you have a plan as improbable as anything I've ever given the dignity of a name. He glanced out and shivered. There are wagers already in the crypts. I lost 3 dragons on paper in 20 breaths. I'm learning to hate paper. Jon looked past him to Sansa, and she nodded, just enough. She had always understood him. She often didn't approve of what she understood. It will fail or succeed utterly, Tyrion said. There will be no middling. Do you know why gamblers prefer dice to coins? Coins have only 2 faces. Dice have 6. More gods to appeal to. Davos snorted. We'll need them all then. Brienne came up the steps with snow on her lashes, Jaime behind her a half-pace, the pair of them thunder and distance. If this is to be done, she said, we must set terms clearly. The armies will stand fast. None will cross. If either side breaks the circle, we break every line we've drawn in fire and blood. Jaime's mouth tipped. I've seen tourneys with worse rules. We are not founding a tourney, Sansa said from the bottom of the steps, voice precise and burnished. We are trying to keep children alive. The Night King is not a knight, Tyrion added. He will not respect rules. He'll respect power, Jon said, and old magic. He looked to the Godswood, where Bran waited. The world had rules when he was made, very soft, like a leaf turning. Another voice said, it still does. Bran sat in his chair beneath the flakes, Theon's hand on the back of it. Ironborn faces around them taut with cold and fear and a kind of wild loyalty. Bran's eyes found Jon without moving his head. He will come if you call him, Jon. Will he speak? Daenerys asked, as if the question embarrassed her and she hated her own hope. No, Bran's gaze slid across the field, far beyond walls and men and time. He remembers language the way dead men remember the warmth of bread. He can read a circle scratched in the ice. Like a contract, Tyrion said. We're in need of a very good scribe, then. Preferably one whose ink doesn't freeze. Melisandre had a way of arriving without snow announcing her, as if fire made its own paths. She spoke from the point where torchlight met shadow. The circles that bind do not want ink. They want blood and breath and vow. She stepped into view. Her red silk looked black in that night, but her eyes were embers. He was made with a blade of obsidian through a heart chained to a weirwood. The old powers recognized symmetry. She looked at Jon in a way that made him think of kneeling. The prince who was promised is never promised a gentle road. Daenerys was stone. If you knew any of this. I know little. Flames show shapes. Men insist on naming them. She dipped her head. And women. I learned too late. I try to learn earlier now. Jon's heart beat with violence against his ribs. If I go, he said to Bran, can you hold them? The dead. He did not know what he was asking. He had seen ravens take flight from Bran's eyes. Wolves toss their heads as if a boy's thoughts were rain on their fur. He did not know what it cost. For a time, Bran said, and not all. You cannot ask winter to wait for spring. His mouth shaped a small smile, so tragic it could have been carved on a gravestone of a beautiful child. But a duel is a name that even ice recalls. I will make it easy for him to hear you. They parted way for Jon like a tide that had learned to love its shore. He looked to each face as he passed, to Tormund, who bared his teeth and gripped his forearm so hard Jon felt the pain in his bones. To Grey Worm, whose nod was as precise as the click of a lock. To Yora, whose gaze carried 100 miles of winter and the weight of a father's sword in Jon's hand. To Gendry, a blacksmith's hammer on his back. To Missandei and Varys in their cloaks, all words died in the mouth. To Sansa, who touched his cheek once with gloved fingers and said nothing because the words would have broken them both. To Arya, who hadn't shown herself until he reached the gate and then was there in an eddy of dark, eyes dangerous. She pressed something flat and cold into his hand. The catspaw dagger. Valyrian steel was always cold and only seemed warm when held by a desperate hand. It wants to be useful, she whispered. You can't. You're not the only one who's been training. She looked past him into the gloom. There was hunger in her, hunger and sharp love. If he cheats, I'll show him how a wolf cheats. Not this time. He gave the dagger back. He didn't know why he did it. He only knew he was himself when he put Longclaw at his hip and nothing else. If it's to be done cleanly. Nothing is clean, she said. But she closed his fingers around his sword hilt and nodded once. Survive. If you don't, I'll kill him anyway. At the gate, Daenerys stopped him with a touch. He could feel the danger of her. How much she might burn to keep something dear that did not want to be held. He knew that danger in himself, too. He kept his voice level. If he kills you, she said, more to the space between them than to Jon, I will burn the world around his feet until even the cold hates him. If he kills me, Jon said, do what keeps them alive. He didn't add please. He did not beg. Not anymore. Her breath fumed. And if he accepts? If he stands there and lets you call him out like some lordling at a feast, then we find out what the world remembers. He rode out on a borrowed courser that hated the cold less than it hated the smell beyond the trench. The hoofbeats sounded too loud in that place, like a prayer spoken in a tomb. The gates thudded shut behind him, sound swallowed immediately by the snow. He felt as alone as he had ever been, even on the ice lakes beyond the fist, even in the quarters where death had curled around him like a cat. He stopped his horse 20 paces from the first rank of the dead. They stared without blinking. Clothes like this, they were a painting. Mouths a little open, many with frost staining the beard, hair frozen in place beyond time's hand. Armor was pulled from graves and half-rotted, leather stiff with winter. One had the black of the Night's Watch, another the tartan of some northern clan Jon had never known. They were a history of losing. He spoke into it. I am Jon Snow, he said, though his voice might have been the wind. I am Lord of Winterfell and a brother of the Night's Watch and the son of a man I do not deserve. I call you to single combat. He drew Longclaw and held it up, the Valyrian ripples in the blade a ghost of old fire. Spare them, he said, and he meant everyone on both sides. He did not know how to mean otherwise. If I fall, you have me. If you fall, you leave. He did not expect an answer. He expected to be consumed. The ranks shifted not forward, not backward, but apart. It was like watching two fields of wheat bow in mirrored wind. A path opened in their silence, straight as a blade, and from the dark beyond the path something brighter than the night moved toward him with a slowness that was not hesitation but inevitability. The Night King came like a storm given legs. He did not ride. He walked. Snow did not gather on him. It changed its mind and went elsewhere. His crown was bone-white frost and his eyes were the blue of glacial ice. He had a face at all because the world thought faces mattered. He stopped within a man's voice of Jon. He did not breathe. The cold around him had presence, a thing you could touch and find it colder on the inside. He raised his left hand and brought his palm to the ground. Frost bloomed outward in a perfect circle, a ring of hoarfrost as precise as a coin's edge. It hissed like a lit fuse, and where the front line of the dead touched it, they stepped back as if respect had been remembered. The circle widened to 40 paces, an arena he had sketched onto the skin of the world. When it closed, the hiss went out. Silence fell so completely that Jon could hear his own blood. The Night King lifted his right hand and formed a spear from the air. Frost connected with the shape of a will. Ice lengthened and grew a sheen like glass under moon. He gave a small inclination of his head, which was not in any language Jon had learned but meant, all the same. I have heard you. I accept. Jon's horse skittered and screamed. He slid from the saddle, smacked its flank, and it bolted, finding the slight gap the dead had left. Alone in the ring, he measured the distance and the man, if man was the word for a memory that had learned to hate being remembered. He loosened his shoulders. He thought of Corran Halfhand in the high places, of Ser Roderick on muddy lawns, of Donal Noy's hands hammering iron and telling the boy who watched that good steel wanted a sure temper more than a fancy name. He thought of the old words spoken in the snow when he had taken his vows, words he could not forget and that did not belong to any king. The Night King moved first. He didn't leap. Leaping was for the living. He was suddenly where he intended to be. Jon had trained his eyes to own footwork, to watch hips and shoulders. It didn't work on something that did not move because it was moved by another law. The spear came in with no warning, and he had to be more instinct than thought. He got long claw up, Valyrian ripples meeting ice in a note like a bell struck underwater. The shock crawled up his arms, found his spine, bit it. He slid away, not giving the ice spear his full force to drive through. They circled. If the dead had breath, the night would have been full of it. Jon felt the ring underfoot hard as glass, slicker than anything he'd fought on. The oil on his blade, his boots. He had planned for this, but planning was a word, and winter was not. The next pass drove at his legs, a sweeping cut meant to take him at the knee. He jumped, and the world made a sound in his nerves when the spear passed. His boot came down on rime and slid, but he caught himself, and when the spear came up he was ready, steel to ice again. The power behind the Night King's strikes was not muscle but season. He would wear a man down. He would take his warmth by stealing the heat from his bones. Daenerys watched from above on Drogon's back, coiled in a black curve against the snow, wings tight to foil the arrows that weren't coming. Jorah sat at her leg, his knuckles white where he gripped a strap. A part of her screamed, not at the unfairness. She had learned the world did not understand that word, but at the absurdity of the silence. Armies yearned to move. Dragons yearned to fly. What she wanted could burn this quiet for miles. She kept her hand clenched and felt her nails bite her palm until the bite told her she was alive. "Let me," she said. She did not know to whom, Jorah or the dragon or the part of herself that had survived every fire and forgetfulness. "You gave him his circle," Jorah replied, and his voice, for all its gravel, was gentle. "Men will remember if you break it, so will the thing that is not a man. If he wins with your help, he will not believe he lost. And if he loses without it?" She didn't take her eyes from the two figures moving in that ring. "Then he never believed anything at all." The dragon's muscles trembled under her, hunger for flight a language she knew better than her own heartbeat now. She stroked his neck and the tremble gentled. She breathed in and out and named the breaths. One for Viserys as he had been in childhood with a wooden sword. One for Rhaegal's death cry when ice had buried itself in his brother in an earlier sky. One for all those children under Winterfell who ought to live to choose their own mistakes. She held. Sansa stood with her hands inside her sleeves and felt her fingers turn to wood. She forced them not to curl into fists because fury would not be allowed the pleasure of heat. Arya was not beside her. That was right. Arya belonged where the quiet was thickest, belonged with the edges. Tyrion muttered occasionally, words that were not words so much as the memory of them. Brienne's jaw worked like a man grinding herbs in a mortar, steady, patient. Jaime watched like he had watched a king die before and learned the lesson badly. In the Godswood, Bran dipped his head, and Theon felt it like a drop of water on the palm before a storm. "What do you need?" Theon asked because he had learned to ask instead of presume. "A stillness," Bran said. "In a place the world has forgotten." His eyes whitened, or they went wider than eyes were meant to go. Theon couldn't tell. The ravens in the tree took to air so quickly it felt as if they had been held back by someone's hand and released. The red leaves shivered though no wind touched them. Theon planted his feet. He had once planted his feet in a hall of men who loved him and been wrong about everything. He would be right about this. Jon's world narrowed until it was two blades and the space between them. The Night King tested him the way water tests a rock, not ferocious but relentless, finding cracks. Jon gave ground, used the backslash as a feint to move to the inside line, swung for the neck with a cut that would have sundered mail and met palm instead. The Night King caught Longclaw by the blade, fingers frosting steel, and for an instant Jon felt the wrongness of it like a scream. Valyrian St. Eel sang when it struck. It did not stop, but it stopped. The Night King's other hand went for Jon's throat. Jon let go. He stepped into the grab, not away, an instinct beaten into him by hours and yards, closer, closer to the power, under it. The freezing grip slid past his ear, scraped his collar, broke leather, burned skin with cold so pure it felt like heat. He twisted, jammed his shoulder against the Night King's chest like a ram, torqued his hips to free the blade. Longclaw slipped in the slick of hoarfrost and breath. He got it back. Not cleanly, but it was in his hand. A spear stabbed the space his head had been, and he ducked, an ice-shaved hair, and he tasted his own blood. He spat it onto the ice at their feet. The red was startling as a rose in winter. Steam rose from it, small but defiant, and where it touched the ice, hairline fissures spidered outward in a simple, honest pattern. He saw it. So did the Night King. They both understood what heat was. On a parapet, Davos hissed. 7, he breathed. Make him step in it. He's not a bloody horse, Tyrion snapped, and then his face changed in that moment of redefining the possible. But even gods have weight. Arya moved through the keep like a shadow that had remembered it was also a girl. She slid along stone, downstairs, across a courtyard where the dead waited like the memory of a flood behind a dam. She could feel something like a hand pressed against their faces. Bran, she thought. Thank you, little brother who sees too far. In the gate tower, she passed the Red Woman. Melisandre's eyes were on the ring, but she smiled as Arya passed, as if she tasted a spice she had not used. You said not this time, Arya murmured to no one and to herself. Not his circle. She went somewhere else. There were White Walkers among the ranks, tall and terrible, blades of ice different from their masters because they had thoughts in them that weren't his. She found one. He turned when she was 10 paces away, but only because the air told him there had been a change in it. He made a sound like wind against a hole in a door. She came in fast. He was fast too. His blade sang. She learned the song in a breath and put her dragonglass in his throat, the point sharp and humble. He shattered like a promise made by a frightened man. Around him, 10 corpses fell like puppets relieved of their strings. Arya exhaled. Useful, she told the dagger. She went to find another. Dany watched Jon draw the Night King toward the place where the fissures had grown like a map of a small, cracked nation. The Night King resisted the draw because men did. He did not move because of persuasion. He moved because of geometry. Jon made the circle smaller by refusing to give space. It became no longer a ring but a problem that could be solved by a single answer. Stepping where Jon had bled. Their blades met again and again. Jon's shoulders burned. He could not feel his fingers. He reminded them that they belonged to him by command. He remembered faces to distract himself from the cold's insistence. Sam's face bent over a book by bad firelight, Ed's laugh broken by a cough, Ygritte's mouth framed by wild hair, Sansa's profile in a Winterfell he had never expected to see again, Arya as a child throwing apples at his head, Bran before he became a river. He remembered his father. Not the one who sired him, but the man who had put a hand on his shoulder and said nothing and meant so much by the silence. The Night King's spear came in low again. Jon stepped to meet it. The world slid under him. He let it. He went with the slip and turned it. The spear's point carved a line across the ice, sudden silver wound, and struck the place where his blood had melted a thin skin. The point plunged through. For the first time, the Night King's weight betrayed him. The spear bit and stuck. In that breath of being fouled, he made the smallest movement Jon had seen him make that was not intentional. A fractional shift of balance. Jon Snow had been taught all his life to make use of little mercies. He went in with Longclaw like a man who understood what the blade had been made for. The Night King's hand shot out again, to catch the blade as he had before. Jon changed the angle, did not lunge for the center line but for the rib beneath that crown of frozen pectoral muscles. A strike meant to skitter and be stopped by bone. The Night King moved to catch a sure thing. His palm met steel. Jon did not resist. He opened his grip. He let the weapon go and in the same breath reached his left, gloved hand for the blade's pommel and shoved through under the catching hand, driving the point the last inch between ribs toward the frozen rumor of a heart. Valyrian steel touched that old wound the children had made in another age. The world remembered. The Night King's eyes widened by something too small to be called surprise. His hand tightened on the blade as if to pluck it out of himself like a thorn that would not matter. He did not move quickly enough. Jon drove, and Longclaw slid in until the hilt kissed ice. He felt the blade buck in his hands as if it had struck a bell placed inside a mountain. Cracks darted outward like lightning frozen mid-sky, and for an instant the Night King looked like a man-shaped glacier that had tried to learn to be a god and failed. He reached for Jon's throat as if habit compelled him, and then his fingers became a spray of sharp, bright ice. The crown broke, not into fragments but into the idea of them finally let go, and he went to Snow. It was quiet. It was so quiet that the sound that followed seemed like a scream when it was not. A sigh. The dead fell. Not neatly, not all at once. Like crops scythed by invisible farmers, they collapsed to their knees and hands and faces. They rolled over and turned into what they had been taken from. A head hit the ice and bounced and became nothing but the truth of its weight. Armor slumped. Horses that had stood wit. Out breaths sank like felled trees. The White Walkers shattered as if the knowledge of how to remain together had been withdrawn. In the sky, a wound of blue fire tore across the dark as Viserion, undone now that the hand had left its strings, wavered. He beat the air twice, 3 times, a great sad motion with no mind behind it, and then plummeted, the sound of him hitting the northern plain a long way off like distant thunder. Jon fell to his knees because his legs did what legs do when they run out of orders. Longclaw lay before him in islands of frost that steamed where his blood had been. He had never been so cold. He had never felt such heat behind his eyes. The ring shrank without anyone touching it, frost retreating like a thought being reconsidered. He found himself laughing, which hurt. He stood up. He could stand. He sheathed Longclaw because there were still rules somewhere that wanted to be respected. He turned to face the wall and saw them. 1,000 small motions suddenly, movement after movement, the living remembering they had bodies. The gates opened with a shout from the men on the bars. He staggered into the mouth of Winterfell because he couldn't think where else men go when the story gives them something impossible and asks them not to lie about it. Daenerys met him there, dropping from Drogon's back while the dragon's breath curled and warmed the stones. Her hair was full of ice. He did not understand how she looked both older and new. Yora was there, face a map of continents where storms had been. Tormund barreled into him, nearly knocking him flat, then caught him and shook him like a friend who had changed the price of beer. Grey Worm nodded once, and that nod felt like a city opening its gates. Davos put a hand on his shoulder. "Well," he said, almost cheerful from the relief, or so near tears he had to pretend it cheer. "You always were a bastard for bad ideas." "They work sometimes," Jon said, and then he had to put his hands on his knees and breathe. Sansa reached him with Arya beside her and Tyrion behind them like a small, complicated shadow. Sansa's eyes were wide and very bright, cheeks flushed with a life that had almost been lost. She looked at him longer than was necessary. She had been practicing needing less than she wanted all her life. He recognized the work of it and loved her more for it. Arya's gaze flicked from his eyes to the blade at his side. Knew that old thing had one good trick left. "It had more than one," he said hoarsely, and then, because he could, he put his arm around her and held her for a breath and felt her let him. She broke away fast, as if the world would disapprove of tenderness. He understood. They gathered in the great hall not because they needed to but because men who have nearly died are drawn to big rooms with roofs that have seen more winters than they have words. Fires burned. The smell of stew and bread rose like a forgiveness no one had asked for aloud. The horns of mead rang and hands shook, and there were the first sobs of men who had kept their grief tied back until they could untie it without making everyone drown. The dead they had lost were also in the room. There is no other way to say it. Every laugh was shadowed. Every cry had another cry behind it. They sat. The benches creaked with new weight. Tyrion produced a cup as if this single act could make sense of everything. "To rules," he said, lifting it, "and to those who remember them when it's inconvenient." "To the north," said Sansa quietly. "To the living," Grey Worm said, in a voice that sounded like a man stepping onto a ship that might or might not hold. "To the prince who was promised," Melisandre whispered, and Jon didn't know if she meant him or the idea that got men to do necessary things because they believed them. Daenerys did not drink. She watched Jon over the rim of a cup she held and did not bring to her lips. When she spoke, the words came slow, as if each one had to be negotiated with. "You won," she said, and the play of something like pride and something like fear in her face would have been beautiful anywhere else. "We won," he said, reflex from a life where collectivities meant survival. Then he swallowed. "We did. All of us." Tormund thumped the table. "He did," he said. The small crow stabbed the big ice man and he broke like bad bread. "You aren't helping me be humble," Jon told him. "I'm not here to help you with that." Tormund bared his teeth. "I'm here to eat." Brienne let out the breath she had been holding since dawn yesterday and folded her hands in her lap when they trembled. Jaime watched those hands, and the look he gave her was a kind of oath that had nothing to do with words. Davos bent his head over his bowl and ate like a man who had not eaten in months. Grey Worm ate and counted who was in the room and who was not, and had already formed lines of names in his head for the wall they would remember them with. Yora sat very straight and let the warmth in his bones. He kept one eye on Daenerys without meaning to, because it was like breathing for him now. "Where is Bran?" Sansa asked. "In the Godswood," Theon answered from the doorway, snow to his knees. He looked tired and lit from within. "He says he'll come when he's done looking." "Looking at what?" Tyrion asked. "Himself, maybe," Theon said, and smiled a smile that had learned the cost of itself. Jon couldn't keep his seat once the room's love and noise wrapped around him. He stood and went, less because the hall didn't hold him than because he wanted to see the tree. He crossed the yard where melted clots of snow and piles of broken weapons and the strange, sudden emptiness of no enemy made a new landscape. He opened the gate to the Godswood and the close. Red hush came down like a cloak. Bran sat beneath the heart tree as he had sat that morning. The blood-red leaves a crown ordinary and sacred both. The face carved into the weirwood H. Add the sorrow of trees. It always had. Bran's mouth made a small shape that might have been a smile and might have been the memory of one. Snow gathered on his hair. Theon stood beside him like a chosen guard. "You did it," Jon said, and then shook his head, corrected himself. "We did." Bran tilted his head. "I watched the world remember a rule," he said. "I saw the fire from above and the cold from underneath, and I saw a man with a blade and another man with a different sort of blade, and I saw what they were both made of. I saw you. Any more prophecies for me?" Jon tried to smile. It felt like lifting a weight he could manage if he had to, but not for long. No, Bran's eyes focused, deep as wells. "Only a question." "All right. Do you know who you are?" Jon wanted to laugh. He managed it. Came out cracked. "A man with cold hands and a warm sword. That will do for tonight," Bran said, and the way he said it made Jon think of a father saying, "Go to bed now. We'll talk in the morning. The rest will come." Theon touched the tree and then his chest where old scars crossed each other in a map of roads he wished he hadn't taken. "I'll stand a while more," he said to Jon. "I don't mind the cold." "I know," Jon said. He did. He returned to the hall and the heat of bodies, of breath, of life. He let the noise wash him and not wash him away. He found a corner where the wall met the hearth and leaned there, watching. It had always been easier for him to watch. He drank because not drinking would have made him stand out, and the drink loosened his chest enough to allow the day's air to leave him. His hands were starting to ache again. That was good. It meant they were still his. Daenerys came to stand where she could see him, but where he would have to walk to her if he wanted to. He did. She could play north and he would go. It had been that way since the frozen lake. He did not know whether to be grateful or afraid. "You're shaking," she said when he reached her. "I'm alive," he said. "That's not all it means," she said softly. She turned the cup in her hands. "I have never lost a battle. Not truly. Not like men lose their names for. I've lost things. I've lost people. I've lost parts of myself. But not battles. Today I didn't win either. I watched. It is a new thing." He nodded. "Watching can be worse. I prefer to act." Her mouth tightened. "I prefer to be the thing that happens to other people." You burned a tyrant alive, and old cities remembered what breath was. It was as close as he could come to saying, I know exactly who you are, and it does not frighten me in a way that makes me want to run. And you stabbed winter under the ribs, she said. And it was as close as she could come to saying, I saw you and I liked what I saw, and it terrifies me. They stood that way a moment longer, with the hall roaring around them, before Yora approached and bowed, the motion small so as not to make it a scene. Your Grace, he said. Ser Yora, she said, and her face warmed for him as it always did. She could be two women at once when she looked at him, the young girl who had met him and the queen she had become because he had believed she could. Rest. Eat. In a moment, he looked to Jon. You've a way of keeping an old sword honest. It keeps itself, Jon said. Yora's eyes went to Longclaw. My father would have been proud. He swallowed. For a man who had faced exile and returned to die a dozen times and had not died yet, his swallow was a child's. Of both of us. He would have shamed me for how much I put on it, Jon said. He would not. Yora smiled, small and round as a coin. He would have reminded you to oil the blade and tell it stories, so it would learn what to cut and what to spare. Tyrion dragged a chair across the floor, set it near Jon without asking, climbed into it with the gracelessness of a man who had forgotten grace was expected, and sighed. If I had a bard who could hold the tone you deserve, I'd ask him to sing tonight, he said. As it stands, we'll have to remember without rhymes. Rhymes lie, Sansa said, joining them. They make men into statues. We will be statues anyway if this keeps up, Tyrion replied, but his eyes betrayed him. They softened when they looked at Sansa, hardened when they looked at the corner where a line of wounded waited for clean bandages. How many? Enough to say the world is mean, she said. Not enough to say we didn't try. The night stretched. Worn bodies went to pallets, the exhausted to tables, the stubborn to firelight with cups that had no bottoms. The dawn would come mean and flat, a gray slab placed on a house to keep it from flying away. When it came, it found Winterfell mended by noise. The horns did not blow. There was nothing to summon. Men were up anyway because men got up. The yard filled with the business of after. The dead were brought to pyres. Songs that had no tune were sung, and the ash rose in columns that made Jon's eyes sting even when he stood far from them. He was at the pyres when Theon joined him, hair crusted with snow, face clean in a way that had nothing to do with water. The God's Wood is quiet now, he said. What did he see? When I asked, he said he was looking at a river that used to be a boy, Theon replied. I don't speak that language. None of us do, Jon said. He watched the flames eat wood. Watched the wood accept being eaten as its last and best job. Thank you. For what? For standing when it mattered to a boy you hurt. For not running when the night could have given you a better excuse than you've ever had. Theon's smile was crooked and delicate. I have a talent for learning the right thing far too late. You learned it. Jon looked at him and saw the room where they'd parted with harsh words and a truth Theon had needed hammer-hard. He was glad. He could be glad in the ashes. That's not nothing. Arya appeared like a cat into a store. Why where there had been no cats? I can't sleep, she announced carelessly. Then, more quietly, I thought I might have to. Circle the deal. She waved a hand. I had a plan for cheating. He snorted. You always do. You did it honestly, she said. Her mouth twisted. That was good. Boring but good. Maybe I'll amaze you some other way, he said. Don't, she said, which was as affectionate as she got. She looked to the fire. They fell like a puppeteer got bored. Or like the story changed its mind about them, Theon offered. Do stories have minds? Arya looked skeptical even as she grinned. Some do, Theon said, and didn't meet anyone's eyes. The ones that own you. Davos moved past with a list in his hand and a frown in his beard. Don't suppose any of you know numbers better than I do, he said without stopping. I do, Tyrion called from a distance, then made a face at the list when Davos handed it to him. I did once. These days numbers come with faces and that ruins the arithmetic. He looked up. We can feed the north a week with what's left if we stretch. He called to no one in particular and everyone at once. After that we starve if the roads don't open, or if dragons don't shy at a bit of rain. Daenerys's pups. She'd never call them that, but that's what the look in her eyes made of her dragons. Slept in the inner yard, their breath tremendous. Rhaegal had hidden himself among the stable's old beams as if playing at something. Drogon lay across the kitchen roof because he could. Men worked around them like they were mountains. They had lost their fear the way a man loses a tooth. Painfully, and with a tongue that couldn't keep from finding the gap. Jon walked near Drogon and felt the heat politely distance him. Drogon opened one eye, slit and golden, then went back to the business of breath. Jon thought of a child's chest rising and falling. Daenerys joined him. They sleep when I want them not to and wake when I want silence, she said, the voice of a woman with sons and no laws to keep them by. She stood very still. I meant to thank you when there weren't listeners. You can thank me with bread, he said, because if he didn't make her smile now the conversation would be a blade that drew blood they didn't have to spend. It worked. Her mouth softened. There will be bread, she said, and work. She watched the men carry a woman to the pyres, a woman no one would sing about. We do the ugly part now. We always do, he said. Jon, she said, and the way she said his name made it a thing that could be put down on a table between them to be considered, not a chain around either of their necks. You risked the world on something that could not promise itself. It did, he said, and surprised himself. It promised itself with a silence that has rules. I recognized it. I have never loved rules, she said. You've kept to some, he replied. She watched him a moment longer. When this is over, she said, and he felt the words like a string drawn between them and tightened until it hummed. When there is no more winter that can be fought with steel, what then? He opened his mouth and closed it. He thought of banners and halls and the way men pretend that making laws is the same as making sense. He thought of Sansa and the North, a proud place with generous hands and interminable memory. He thought of ships and cities and dragons fast as weather. He thought of his name as he wore it here among stones that had known him as a boy. He thought of his other name, the one that had been put on him like a borrowed cloak that didn't fit and warmed him anyway. Bread, he said finally. We'll need bread, and to teach the living to live with each other without winter's excuse. She laughed, short and surprised with it. A modest program, she said, and when she reached to touch his sleeve he let her, and when he stepped nearer for warmth she let him, and when they were both warmed they stepped away because the day belonged to 100 other hands. The sun rose thin and pale and made the snow glare. It kissed the top of the heart tree and made its red leaves look as if they bled. It ran along the line of pyres and made smoke flatter and the tears of men look like something that might be taken as a gift. The world had not changed except that it had. Tallies were made. Graves were cut into ice. The body of the Night King was not found, not even the rim of a crown. It seemed right that nothing of him had weight anymore. The cold remained because the cold belongs to no man. But the silence lifted. Crows returned to the battlements and argued. A child laughed, and the laugh startled 3 veterans into turning their heads as if at a shot. In the evening, Bran came to the great hall, pushed by Theon and accompanied by a hush that did not fear itself. He looked no more tired than he had that morning. He had the same air of a boy who has figured out how a trick works and understands that knowing will not keep him from loving the performance. When he spoke, it was to the room. It will snow tomorrow, he said, and it was a kindness. And melt by midday. The road south will be ugly with mud and good for carts. Good, Tyrion said, downing what remained of his 4th glass as if it were water and he a plant. I hate clean roads. They lead men to do tidy things. Some of us like tidy, Sansa said, but she was smiling. Brienne and Jaime stood at the end of a table handing bowls to men who had earned them. Gendry fixed a broken clasp as if it were a living thing with a wound. Grey Worm talked with Missandei in the low way of a man whose language has always been a uniform and who has learned he owns a voice too. Tormund tried to teach a handful of boys how to laugh without spitting their stew. Davos wrote items on a list and crossed them off and felt like a king for doing it. Jon sat with Longclaw across his knees and ran an oiled cloth along its blade. Ash. He told it a story because Yora's words had stuck as if they had barbs. He told it the story of a boy who had learned how hard it is to keep a promise to yourself. He told it of a girl with a bow who had red hair like a flag and a laugh like a secret. He told it of a man who wasn't a father and was better for that. He told it of a king that wasn't, a queen that was, of dead men who had learned to be quiet and then couldn't help themselves. The sword took the story the way a thirsty ground takes rain. The blade shone with a light that was not light. Exactly. He liked the look of it. He liked that it asked for more. Later, when the hall grew gentle and he had almost come to believe that night would not bring a new horror, he stepped into the yard to breathe clean air and find stars. He saw them, sharp and close, as if the sky had stepped toward him to be friendly for once. He stood until the cold found the seams of his coat, and then longer, to convince the cold he was not afraid of it. Footsteps on snow came light but sure. Arya stood beside him, arms folded tight against herself in a posture that had always meant she was thinking of leaving a place even as she learned it. "I don't like what happens next," she said. "You don't know what happens next," he said. "I can smell it." She stared toward the south, where a black line of trees cut the sky. Men like this sort of peace because it makes them think they earned it. Then they go ruin it by trying to own it. "I'm not a man like that," he said, a little defensive where he hadn't intended to be. "I know," she said simply. It shamed him more than a rebuke would have. She flicked a glance at him. "You going to tell the world your secrets now that there's time for secrets again?" He thought of a dark hall underground and whispers and a truth that had felt like theft and like a gift. He thought of Daenerys's face when he told her and the way both of them had been afraid of the shape of the thing more than the thing. "Maybe," he said, "or maybe I'll let the world tell me what it wants. I'm tired of telling it who I am." "Don't let it do that," she said. "Make it ask. Make it kneel if it wants. Make it fight you for the right to know." She grinned, fierce and small and as his sister as anything had ever been. "I'll help you cheat." He laughed then, and the laugh warmed him where no fire could. "I'll keep that in mind." She squeezed his arm once with a strength that made him remember the way she moved in the yard and on rooftops and in war, then vanished with a swiftness that would have been magic if he hadn't known it was practice paid for with bruises. He was still smiling when Daenerys found him. She had a cloak around her shoulders that had once been her brother's or someone's brother's, cloth with history. She stood close because closeness had never frightened her, even when it should. For once, she didn't reach for him or for words. She let the night lay on them both. "Do you remember what the Red Woman said?" she asked eventually, voice quieter than the snow. "Which time?" He kept his tone light because the alternative was heavy enough to crack a man. "About symmetry. About old magic." She watched his face. "About prices." "Ido. What price did you pay today, Jon Snow?" It was not a challenge. It was not even a test. It was curiosity and admiration and an edge of fear. He thought about it, which he'd promised himself to do before he answered her when it mattered. "A piece of myself that was certain it wanted to keep breathing," he said. "The rest of me was convinced. That piece was stubborn. It left a mark when it went." She nodded as if that made a sense she had lived with before. "I have paid those," she said, and the snow settled on her hair and didn't melt because she had taught herself to be a kind of flame that didn't show. "We have more to pay." "I know." He looked south where the road would turn to mud and men would argue and bread would be baked and broken again. "But for a little while." "For a little while," she echoed, and this time when she reached for his hand, he took it. And they stood that way like two people who had made the same bad bargain with the world and learned to love what they took from it anyway. The dead would be named. The living would tell those names to their children. Banners would be sown. Oaths sworn. The quiet that followed this night would not last, because quiet never did in a country where the wind is one of the lords. But a rule had been remembered, and that mattered. A boy had become a man in front of a winter that wanted him not to, and that had mattered too. somewhere in the godswood, where the heart tree kept its counsel and the snow melted like old letters, Bran Stark closed his eyes and opened them and saw nothing but the night. He smiled. It was a private smile, the kind that belongs to people who hold more of the world than their hands can show. He could have told anyone who asked that no war ends. He could have told them that every duel binds and unbinds 1,000 other things. He kept the knowledge and listened to the wind move through the red leaves, which sounded today like applause. In Winterfell's yard, Longclaw rested on Jon's knees and reflected stars. They looked like the points of a crown or the eyes of a dragon or the nails in a door or nothing at all but their own small, impossible fires. Jon rubbed the blade once more and let the cloth hang. He felt the tug of sleep and knew he would keep it at the door a little longer, the way a sentry keeps a guest whose hands he does not entirely trust. He had never been more tired. He had never felt more awake. The cold inhaled and exhaled around him. No longer a hand at his throat, but a reminder at the back of his neck that life was a loan that required attention. The road south would turn to mud by midday. The pyres were embers now. The smoke had thinned until the stars could look through it and not cry. The dragons dreamed. The wolves in the woods lifted their faces and told each other things wolves tell each other, which are always the same things and always new. He closed his eyes. He could see it again if he wanted to. The ring drawn on ice like a coin. The spear of winter caught by a blade made when men remembered what they were. The small slip of a god's foot on a place where a man's blood had taught the world something. The moment when nothing made of cold could stand any longer against the simple warmth of stubborn mortal work. He let it pass. He opened his eyes and looked at the sky and said nothing because nothing needed to be said. The night answered him with the only benediction it had. It did not take him. The breath he drew then felt like he was beginning, not ending. He stood, and the snow fell as it always had, and the world, for this hour, held.